Xi Jinping, with a quiet and very calm demeanor, is the supreme leader of one of the oldest and largest nations on the planet. Often ignored, misunderstood, or rejected, but moving forward to become the world's leading power. Let's learn more today about the People's Republic of China, about the famous Chinese model that lifted hundreds of millions out of poverty in just a few decades, with a rigid and hierarchical political regime, and about the life and thinking of its current leader, Xi Jinping. Although all of this requires much deeper analysis, let's make a first approach. This is Reynaldo Carrillo Vilches speaking. And for those who have asked, how can you support the new encyclopedia? We've launched a Patreon featuring exclusive documentaries on controversial topics and live seminars taught by us. And with several more benefits, your support is essential to keep this project alive. You can find the link below, and in case you don't have an international card for Patreon, we have several payment options for you, and you will still be included in the community. We'll wait for you there. Now let's start today's video. Xi Jinping was born on June 15, 1953, in Beijing, the capital of the People's Republic of China, following Chinese naming conventions. The name Xi is the family surname, and the name Jinping is his given name at the time of Xi Jinping's birth. The Xi family is not just any family. His father is Xi Songshu, who was then the head of the propaganda department of the Chinese Communist Party and an important military leader aligned with the communist cause. During the 1930s and 1940s war years, Xi Jinping, as the son of a high-ranking official of that great nation, has a childhood marked by power and hierarchy, which progresses at the pace of his father's position. By 1959, Xi Songshu, his father, is promoted to vice premier, while also working in the State Council of all China. His son, the boy Xi Jinping, attends schools for China's ruling elite and accompanies his father. In addition, at official meetings in the grand government palaces, such as Zhongnanhai, he becomes familiar with that atmosphere of power from an early age. But suddenly, that heavy and sumptuous environment collapses. In 1962, when his father, Xi Songshu, is accused by Kang Shen, who at that time was the Minister of State Security of the Republic of China, of having allowed the publication of a novel with alleged criticism of President Mao Zedong. Immediately afterward, his father is stripped of all his positions and placed under house arrest, which suddenly destroys his prestige and that of the entire Xi family. All of this had a huge impact on every member of the family, especially on Xi Jinping, who was 9 years old. The Chinese Communist Party, both at that time and today, and within the context of the prevailing revolutionary process, is the main pillar of government and governance in China. All major decisions of that old empire had to go through the Communist Party at that time, which was not free from all kinds of internal and external threats. And that government and governance, at that time, it was exercised by a man named Mao Zedong, the supreme leader of the People's Republic of China, president of the Communist Party and of the Central Military Commission, also serving as the supreme commander of the armed forces. Mao Zedong had been one of the founders of the Chinese Communist Party in 1921 and one of the architects of the rise and popularization of communism in China. During those decades of the 1920s and 1930s, in a context of intervention by foreign powers, political instability, and economic crisis, in the midst of what has become known as the Century of Humiliation, they are leading that country into an internal conflict that will pit the nationalists of the so-called Kuomintang, led by a military man named Chiang Kai-shek, against the communists who at this point are completely led by Mao Zedong. So, between the years 1927 to 1937 and from 1946 to 1949, after a brief truce due to the Japanese invasion, the so-called Chinese Civil War took place in China. Above all, this fascinating century of Chinese humiliation and the lives and work of Mao Zedong and Chiang Kai-shek. We have some excellent videos on our channel which we invite you to watch to delve deeper into the rich history of China. After the Civil War, the Communists won a decisive victory. And in 1949, the People's Republic of China was solemnly proclaimed by Mao Zedong himself, who, acclaimed by a large number of people, became the undisputed leader and head of the nation. China was the second largest nation after the Russian Empire to proclaim itself as a communist republic. Mao promotes the transformation of China towards a communist model, which he supported, called by some as orthodox communism, imposing in China political and economic measures, such as the redistribution of farmland, a centrally planned economy by the state, and the nationalization of industry in China. The extension of the party into the state to establish the dictatorship of the proletariat and its influence on political decisions. Alongside this, China joins the so-called Soviet bloc and begins commercial and diplomatic relations with communist countries worldwide. Meanwhile, it maintains tense relations, at least on the surface, with the United States and with the West. The Xi family's life is upended when Xi Jinping's father falls out of favor with the Chinese regime. It was actually a precursor to the Chinese Cultural Revolution. From 1966 to 1976, it was a process of transformation and socio-political purge, carried out by Mao Zedong to, quote, eradicate the capitalist and traditionalist remnants in China. This happened amid a power struggle within the Chinese Communist Party, which even forced Mao Zedong to resign from the position of General Secretary, to step down from the presidency of China. And it actually became his way of returning to power as an adolescent. Xi Jinping experienced this cultural revolution of Mao Zedong, during which schools and universities were closed, aimed to create a new national order by neutralizing the country's internal and external enemies, as well as cultural elements that were not aligned with the communism of the Chinese Communist Party. Schools and universities were closed and students were incorporated into the so-called Red Guards. Critics and defectors of the regime were harshly repressed, with hundreds of thousands of deaths, and a large part of China's cultural heritage was destroyed by supporters of Mao's revolution. In December 1968, Xi Jinping, who was a high school student at the time, was affected by an executive order from Mao Zedong. He is sent to the countryside along with thousands of young people, professionals, and well-educated university students from the cities in order to be re-educated by the peasants, in order to create a more equal society. In this context, Xi Jinping is sent to Yang Prefecture in Shanxi Province, and his stay in this place will last until 1975. It would be an unparalleled period for anyone who was taken from the city to live in the countryside. According to biographers, Xi Jinping learned several valuable lessons during this time about life in the interior of China, as well as about the psychology of the Chinese people. There, he lives and works alongside the peasants of that Chinese region. He sees the difficulties of rural life and learns tough agricultural tasks that were previously unknown to him, in conditions that he himself has acknowledged as precarious. Xi Jinping was so deeply marked by those experiences in Yang that in his autobiographical writings, he would write about them almost like a mantra. I quote, "Later in life, whenever I faced difficulties, I would think about that period. How could I not move forward when I was able to work under such extremely difficult conditions?" End quote. To understand the power that China is today and the head of state that Xi Jinping, we should closely examine the government system that has sparked much discussion and been established in China. Mao conceives a political structure for the new China, in which the state, in all its extension, as an entity, it was governed directly and exclusively by the Chinese Communist Party, which truly became the new sovereign of the nation. By virtue of this, which is also much talked about but little studied, there is the Chinese Communist Party, composed of various entities that are governed in a collegial manner. The first is the National Congress of the party, which meets every 5 years and whose main function is to appoint the members of the Central Committee of the party and to define the ideological line and political action. The Central Committee is responsible for implementing that line of action and appoints the provincial leaders. Parallel to the Central Committee of the party is the Politburo, whose members are elected by the Central Committee, and it makes daily decisions on foreign policy, economy, and security with influence at the provincial level. And above the Politburo is the Politburo Standing Committee, made up of only 7 members. And it is the highest executive and decision-making body of the nation, the one that approves military actions, budgets, key appointments, and other aspects. And on the other hand, in terms of defense, there is the Central Military Commission of the party, which directs everything related to the command of the Chinese Armed Forces, whose official name is the People's Liberation Army. In practice, the one who has traditionally dominated and presided over all these party bodies is the General Secretary himself. The party becomes the heart and brain of the nation. It is complemented by the rest of the body, which are the organs of the state. In that People's Republic of China, they have it. First of all, there is the National People's Congress, made up of 3,000 deputies directly elected in each province by the population. It is this National Assembly that appoints the State Council, which carries out the daily policies proposed by the party's Politburo and selects the ministerial cabinet. It is also this assembly that officially appoints the Supreme Court of Justice, which is in charge of the judicial branch at the national level. And it is also this National People's Assembly that appoints for a 5-year term the President of the People's Republic of China, a largely symbolic and ineffective position, which is unsurprisingly little known. And the person who has held the highest office of the Chinese Communist Party since March 20th, 1943, that is, the position of General Secretary of the party, is Mao Zedong. Xi Jinping was born and raised in this political world. And in these same years, from 68 to 75, Mao's China changed its stance toward the Western world, mainly with the United States, with whose representatives it began diplomatic talks. Throughout this period, which is also marked by the implementation of some mild economic liberalization measures, representatives of major international capitalists, such as Henry Kissinger and the Rockefellers, hold meetings and establish both secret and not-so-secret relationships to bring in international capital and finance China's economy. Everything seems to indicate that after Mao Zedong, a very different era is coming for China. In 1975, after 9 failed attempts because he was the son of a traitor, Xi Jinping was finally accepted and managed to join the Chinese Communist Party, and his first position was as party leader in a small commune in the prefecture. The Xi Jinping of those years is remembered by those who knew him as someone polite, quiet, and an avid reader, always making sure, on his nights off, to have a lamp to read the classics of Chinese history, both ancient and contemporary, as well as books about figures such as Henry Kissinger, the United States Secretary of State and National Security Advisor, who at that very moment was one of the main figures in international relations and the direct architect of the rapprochement between China and the United States. As Mao Zedong's revolutionary process neared its end in 1975, the works were reopened. Universities, so Xi Jinping leaves the countryside for good and enrolls in chemical engineering at the prestigious Tsinghua University. Shortly after, on September 9, 1976, Mao Zedong died of a heart attack. So the political forces of the time rev up to fill the power vacuum in that huge nation left by the death of its leader. The man who prevails is Deng Xiaoping, a communist from the old guard and key figure in Mao Zedong's government. But he belonged to a faction that was considerably more open to international capital and more liberal reforms. He is going to start a process of gradual economic opening in which several of Mao Zedong's policies will be abandoned. And there will be an effort to get closer to the Western world, liberalizing the economy without liberalizing the political system. Within the Chinese Communist Party, there was an old guard that was inclined to maintain the more conservative policies of Mao Zedong's orthodox Chinese communism, while another faction was more inclined toward opening up to the West and to international capital. This process would affect not only the life of Xi Jinping, but also the lives of what were already at that time 950 million Chinese people. It is estimated that from the reform process of the Chinese Communist Party and Deng Xiaoping in 1976 up to the year 2012, including the governments of General Secretaries Jiang Zemin and Hu Jintao. In China, more than 700 million people have been lifted out of poverty, according to World Bank figures. We're not exaggerating. And of course, the Chinese people have faced all kinds of social problems, conflicts, and difficulties from then until today. Returning to Xi Jinping's life following Mao Zedong's death and the Cultural Revolution's end, his father, Xi Zongjing, is acquitted of his former accusations of treason and is appointed as the first party secretary in Guangdong province in 1979. With this, the Xi family returned to the Chinese political elite. In 1979, Xi Jinping finished his studies in chemical engineering and got married for the first time to Kei Lingling, the daughter of an important Chinese diplomat. From this year onward, Xi Jinping would work in the military sector as an assistant to Zhang Biao, who was none other than the Minister of National Defense of China, with whom he worked for 3 years until he became secretary of the Military Commission of Shanding County. This county belonged to Hebei Province, where Xi Jinping was also simultaneously serving as Deputy Secretary General of the Chinese Communist Party. In this same year, Xi Jinping divorced his first wife without having any children with her. But the decisive leap came in 1985 when Xi Jinping moved to the coastal province of Fujian as Deputy Secretary of the Communist Party in Xiamen, one of the province's most important port cities. There, in Fujian, Xi Jinping would have an uninterrupted political presence until 2002. When Xi Jinping first arrived in Fujian, it was one of the provinces experiencing the dizzying changes of Deng Xiaoping's economic reforms most rapidly. The establishment of special economic zones for foreign capital investment, the takeoff of the national manufacturing industry, and the export market for Chinese goods, tax flexibility for economic actors, easy access to credit, and many other measures whose main goal was to boost Chinese industry and the economy, as well as to turn China into a global economic powerhouse. It is in the Fujian region where Xi Jinping is a key figure for the takeoff of that province. Gradually, he rises through the ranks, becoming vice governor, deputy party secretary of the province, and then governor of the same, standing out as one of the Chinese officials who carried the banner of modernization and economic opening. He is directly involved in designing economic and strategic development plans with short, medium, and long-term goals. In that region, he promotes and oversees the creation of projects such as the Changle International Airport, the Port of Fuzhou, and multiple mixed business groups. Those policies, in which Xi Jinping, as a bureaucrat, played a notable role, resulted in a 12.58% increase in the provincial gross domestic product of that region and attracted tens of billions of dollars in foreign investment. And in cities of that region, such as Ningde, 90% of the population was lifted out of poverty. Xi Jinping, in his position, was known for his proactivity in managing public affairs, with his motto being to act immediately. He was considered strict when it came to punishing irregular or corrupt acts, having initiated legal proceedings against more than 400 officials accused of corruption. During his time in Xiamen, after Xiamen comes Hu Jintao, who would go on to govern China for 10 years. Not without problems and difficulties at this time. In 2002, Xi Jinping had already been a public servant for more than 20 years. And not only had he proven to be relentless and effective in public administration, but he had also built a formidable network of collaborators and people who believed in his leadership, who kept driving his rise through the ranks of the party. And with the death of Jiang Zemin, Xi Jinping's time in Xiamen also comes to an end, and he now becomes the secretary of the Communist Party. In the coastal province of Zhejiang, located in eastern China, Zhejiang was one of the Chinese provinces with the highest economic growth and a global benchmark for entrepreneurship and economic reforms. At that time, it was one of the first provinces that had opened economically to foreign capital in the Chinese world. Zhejiang was a highly developed province in terms of infrastructure, urban planning, economy, and education. Although, like the rest of China, it still experienced significant inequality, especially among those living in rural areas. As the party secretary in that province, Xi devoted himself to working on this problem. And he is the one who has the final say in the economic, political, and social decisions of that province. So at the regional level, Xi Jinping serves as the top authority. So in this sense, convinced that it was necessary to enlist the rural population in the party's political program, he promotes migration from the countryside to the city. A growing urban middle class. So Xi Jinping's focus as a sort of governor of this state is centered on the big cities, as promoters of Chinese economic development and as guarantors of better opportunities than what the countryside could offer. In Zhejiang, Xi Jinping bets on foreign investment, which he said is not just about capital, but also about knowledge, skill, and technology for the sake of Chinese development. With Xi Jinping, the province of Zhejiang maintained an annual growth rate of 14% for 10 years, making it one of the most dynamic Chinese provinces during that period. Xi Jinping also promotes a narrative and environmental measures that materialized in projects like green mountains and clear waters. He also continued his tough anti-corruption program, earning the nickname Mr. Clean at the time for cleaning up irregularities and corruption in the local public administration. By 2007, Xi Jinping completed his successful and effective tenure in the Zhejiang region, and by virtue of his 25 years not only as a party man, but also as a statesman, he was appointed as a member of the Standing Committee of the Political Bureau of the Chinese Communist Party. That is to say, he was elevated to become one of the 7 members of the nation's highest executive and decision-making body, and one of the 7 possible successors to the then secretary of the Communist Party, Hu Jintao. In this way, Xi Jinping was getting closer and closer to becoming the most powerful man in China. Xi Jinping makes his way in a Chinese government and Communist Party that, in the face of growing corruption and fragmentation, they see in a man like Xi Jinping someone capable of facing these problems and maintaining the policy of promoting economic development. Xi Jinping, with his cautious and serious manner and high competence, was, among other things, a consensus figure within the party. He was well regarded by various internal factions within the party, such as the Tongpai faction, which was more aligned with Hu Jintao, and with a more socialist tendency, as well as the Red Princes faction, who were heirs of the former Jiang Zemin, and had a more open and capitalist tendency. The following year, in 2008, Xi Jinping was appointed Vice President of China, which, although more symbolic than factual, brought Xi Jinping closer to the highest positions in China. This appointment was complemented in 2010 when he was named Vice Chairman of the Central Military Commission, now theoretically making him the second in command of the Chinese army. In this sense, by the end of 2012, with Hu Jintao's term as General Secretary of the Communist Party of China already exhausted, and therefore as the head of state of that nation, and once all the necessary internal and external arrangements and agreements were made, the 27th National Congress of the Communist Party of China convened to appoint Xi Jinping as the General Secretary of the party. With this appointment, Xi Jinping assumed the most politically powerful position in the entire Chinese nation, consolidating his rise to power. In that gigantic country, with its millennia-old tradition, the nation and people with the largest population on the planet were in the midst of a growth process. Shortly after becoming General Secretary of the Communist Party of China, on March 14, 2013, Xi Jinping was appointed both President of the People's Republic of China and Chairman of the Central Military Commission, leading what some call the three pillars of government. In China, the party, the state, and the army. It is the first time, perhaps since Mao Zedong, that a man has concentrated so much power in that Chinese nation. Well, for example, Hu Jintao and Yan Shimin were not necessarily general secretaries of the party, presidents of the republic, and chairmen of the military commission simultaneously. That's why some historians, both inside and outside China, have compared Mao Zedong and Xi Jinping, although with considerably different styles, as great leaders and entrepreneurs. In his inaugural speech, Xi Jinping declares that the goal of his government will be to realize the so-called Chinese dream and the rejuvenation of the nation, which means that China, despite its millennia-old history, should always be at the forefront of global progress, supported by, quote, socialism with Chinese characteristics, with solutions based on the study of China's historical reality, under Maoist perspectives and those of Marxism-Leninism, so it is essential to address this. Xi Jinping's political thought is mainly nourished by three sources, the first of which is Leninism. Xi Jinping outlines four key principles: the so-called democratic centralism, in which individuals submit themselves to the party to ensure cohesion and discipline; the vanguard party, in which the party must take the lead in the reconstruction of society according to its. Another principle is, quote, the party controls the action cadres. That is, the party must control all appointments in all power structures. And finally, that the party must have its partisan presence at all possible levels of society. In Xi Jinping's thinking, the presence of these elements has been called, quote, party centrism, the second source of Xi Jinping's thought, are fundamental aspects of Maoism, such as the need for constant rectification of the party, the existence of strong national pride, and economic, technological, and assistance independence from abroad. Xi Jinping adds elements of Maoism to the so-called Leninist party centrism, such as the postulate that power must be concentrated in the supreme leader, merging personal authority with institutional authority. This is viewed as essential to sustain the socialist revolution. This fact is also reflected in other aspects of the Chinese government, such as the presence of state leadership in education at all levels, and the selective repression of so-called enemies of the nation. And the third source of Xi Jinping's thought is the lessons from the Chinese philosophical schools of legalism and Confucianism. According to these schools, holding power in a hegemonic, exclusive, and authoritarian way always equated to cohesion and social stability. In a social environment where each individual must recognize and accept their role in society, and above all, accept the relationship between ruler and ruled. Individual fulfillment and happiness are possible through the fulfillment and happiness of the collective, although it is complex and nuanced. This system of ideas has been called Xi Jinping thought and continues to be a subject of study for today's ideologists and academics. So let's go back to the beginning of his term. Xi Jinping places special emphasis on the Chinese economy. For Xi Jinping, there are three economic priorities for the Chinese government: ensuring China's economic strength, substantially increasing the country's economic order, and achieving so-called common prosperity. At that time, China's gross domestic product was $8.5 trillion, and China was the second largest economy in the world. Xi Jinping intends to strengthen it further, arguing that our economy is big, but not strong. For this purpose, in 2013, Xi Jinping launched the Belt and Road Initiative, an extensive international investment plan in which China has negotiated with more than 150 countries for the construction of public works with Chinese companies, both joint ventures and private, among others, aligned with the Chinese government. Experts say this initiative has left China with nearly $600 billion. Has it managed to make China surpass the United States and the European Union in terms of international contracts in recent years? In 2015, Xi Jinping launched the Made in China 2025 plan. In this plan, China seeks global leadership in 10 technological sectors: robotics, information technology, agricultural machinery, renewable energy, biomedicine, and other areas. At the same time, it establishes that 70% of the technological supply in China must be produced locally. For this purpose, Xi Jinping has the so-called guidance funds, which have served as the main vehicles for financing the growing technological innovation in China, which has continued to occupy more and more space worldwide, from then until now. With this program, China is also becoming a leader in the export of manufactured goods internationally, replacing the United States as the main trading partner in some countries. During the administration of Xi Jinping, between 2013 and 2021, about 99 million Chinese people are said to have risen to the middle class, that is, escaped poverty, according to official Chinese indicators. Another important reform by Xi Jinping in 2016 was when he put a stop to centralization. 2012. About 40% of Chinese companies were state-owned and controlled 100% of China's strategic sectors. That means energy, banking, and telecommunications, but they represented a large part of China's public debt, and for the most part, they didn't operate efficiently. In this scenario, Xi Jinping ordered a large number of these state-owned companies to close, and for a percentage of them to operate under a mixed ownership model with private capital. So that small percentage intended for the control of the previously mentioned strategic sectors would now be self-sufficient, supported by private capital, which would take on a good part of the functions. According to the Chinese government, this has led to an increase in productivity efficiency and job creation throughout the nation. At the same time, Xi Jinping has promoted the proliferation of a large number of private companies, although always staying within the line. What about the party's national leadership and policies? So by the time this video is published, That country, labeled as communist by much of the world, has about 93% of its companies in private ownership. This has sparked a major global debate about not just China's economic model, but also its political, social, and philosophical models. There are multiple viewpoints, ranging from those who believe this is the highest stage of communism, to those who say that China has succumbed to the Western-style capitalism that the famous Chinese model so strongly opposed, in which supposedly more than 800 million people have already been lifted out of poverty over a period of 60 years. And as the Chinese nation advances as a global hegemonic power, it has unique characteristics of its own that cannot be categorized into ideological models, not only because they are old. The case of the Chinese economy. This is no different, where an economic model is formulated that could hardly be called communism or capitalism or any other paradigm from another place and time. There are even those who compare this Chinese model more closely to a kind of corporatist fascism. The case of the Chinese model has been studied and will continue to be studied, compared to state capitalism or market socialism. The truth is that while the state allows open and significant participation of private property, not only national but also international, in the economy, the state and party remain the guiding forces of the nation's destiny. And even above any private capital, no matter how large it is, the state still has the greatest participation in the economy, and the private sector is under its strict supervision. At the political level, since coming to power, Xi Jinping has launched a strong anti-corruption campaign at all levels of public administration. Between 2002 and 2013, nearly 1 million Chinese officials at all levels were prosecuted. Today, that number stands at approximately 6 million officials prosecuted in the last 13 years of government, some for notorious acts of corruption, others for betraying the party, and others under different circumstances. However, this figure is not fully verified, and there is debate about the actual number of people who have been prosecuted. Besides the anti-corruption campaign, Xi Jinping introduced the 4 confidences in 2015: destiny, theory, system, and culture, encouraging the Chinese people to trust in these areas. While repeatedly rejecting so-called Western values, Xi Jinping has also maintained strict control over media and public education. But also, with the so-called Operation Kinlan of 2016, which remains in effect to this day and is carried out annually, the Chinese government thoroughly directs and supervises the information that enters and leaves China, not only in mass media but also through the internet and social networks. For example, there are numerous penalties for those who share vulgar or pornographic content. For example, do they exist? China maintains strict control over its social networks and shields itself from foreign influences, making its cyberspace among the world's most autonomous. Some international organizations have spoken out against some actions of Xi Jinping, such as the so-called internment camps, places where allegedly ethnic minorities such as Tibetans and Uyghurs, as well as other religious groups, defectors, and political prisoners would be forced to work. Segregated from Chinese society, and even some exposed to very bad treatment, extrajudicial executions, and other forms of enslavement. In the cultural sphere, Xi Jinping's administration has been characterized by a constant exaltation of China's long history and its ancient culture, advancing many research projects and spreading culture, as long as they don't stray too far from the official party narrative, which puts the Chinese people at the forefront as the subject and protagonist of history and their struggle for emancipation from foreign rule and colonialism. Without denying the new secular civil tradition of the Chinese Communist Party, there is an effort to recover, unlike Mao, some traditional elements. On March 11, 2018, in an unexpected move for many, Xi Jinping removed the restriction that limited a person to 2 presidential terms in China. And he is reelected by the Assembly for a second presidential term, also giving him the green light to continue holding legislative and executive powers. Shortly after this re-election, then United States President Donald Trump ordered $50,000 in tariffs to be applied to all Chinese products, a decision motivated by, quote, China's unfair trade practices, which Trump used as an argument in that trade war. With this, Trump began. The ongoing trade war between the United States and China has fluctuated between agreements and disappointments, in which Xi Jinping has responded with tenacity to the high tariffs imposed by the United States on its exports. This war, according to some scholars, has not only resulted in detriment to the United States economy, but has also opened up paths for China to negotiate more freely with other nations. It should be noted that currently, Xi Jinping's China is the largest trading partner of 150 countries in the world. In this sense, in terms of international politics, Xi Jinping is praised by both critics and supporters as a true master of diplomacy. Xi Jinping bases his foreign policy on a principle he formulated himself, titled A Shared Future for Mankind, in which, according to him, China should openly collaborate with the nations of the world in pursuit of global common prosperity. This principle has been interpreted as a fulfillment of China's economic policy, with which Xi Jinping has projected Chinese techniques to other countries, both developed and developing. And another aspect that represents a conviction in the thought and actions of Xi Jinping is the unification of China with the island of Taiwan. Viewed as China, not as equals, of its history and its territory, despite the refusal of the so-called Republic of China, also known as Taiwan. This dispute has led to ongoing clashes in the South China Sea since 2016, the same one in which the United States and Japan have become involved to confront the so-called Chinese incursions. Militarily, Xi Jinping has focused on elevating and strengthening the armed forces, as well as improving the technology of the officially named People's Liberation Army. By 2020, compared to 2012, it had already acquired 2 aircraft carriers, 20 destroyers, 80 fighter jets, and approximately possesses 150 nuclear warheads. Thanks to a defense budget of $180 billion, which positioned China as the third most powerful armed force in the world in 2020. An event that, without a doubt, marks a turning point in Xi Jinping's administration. It's the so-called 2020 pandemic and the measures, and the quarantine that followed it for at least 2 years. China was at the center of debate, criticism, and objections, since the official information at first, which was quite questionable and unclear, was that the virus had originated in the Chinese city of Wuhan. And what seemed at first like a weakening of the reputation, at a time when Xi Jinping's government was in power, in the long run actually helped consolidate his position as the supreme leader of China. Because all this context of extraordinary measures allowed for any action necessary to stabilize his hold on power. In the midst of this global quarantine in 2020, the Chinese government ventured into the so-called social credit system, a controversial system whose information remains unclear to this day. It would allegedly function as a massive digital surveillance apparatus over the population, with financial and administrative incentives for citizens who behave according to the rules and are loyal and trustworthy, and with disincentives for those who display inappropriate behavior. The quarantine years were full of global anxiety. Economically, China suffers major setbacks during these years. The rapid annual growth of China's gross domestic product, which had lasted for quite some time, comes to a halt. Unemployment increases and consumption declines. Along with purchasing power, investment freezes, and both public and private credit stagnate, causing a crisis in several sectors of the country. Even so, in February 2021, Xi Jinping announces to the world that China has ended poverty. According to various estimates, they were already earning more money than the minimum considered by the government to cover basic needs, presenting it globally as a success in how quickly people were lifted out of poverty. And beyond these 2 years of international quarantine uncertainty, Zhongguo continues with its commercially expansionist policy. By the end of 2022 and 2023, Xi Jinping lifts the quarantine that was in place throughout the whole Chinese nation and the vast majority of travel restrictions. Commercial dynamism is returning, but slowly. In March 2023, amid rampant unemployment and economic imbalances. After this turbulent period, Xi Jinping is re-elected by the party for a third term until 2028. Now setting his goals on technological self-sufficiency, real, not nominal, economic growth, and strengthening the domestic market. And despite the growth in China's maintenance as a world power, in many sectors, there continue to be situations of financial instability, reflected, for example, in the real estate sector, with small crises occurring, until the end of 2023, when Xi Jinping decides, as an economic strategy, to focus resources on the production of goods demanded both internationally and domestically, such as electric vehicles, lithium batteries, and semiconductors. For his part, during 2024 and up to today, although less tense, relations with the United States remain conflictive. This has led Xi Jinping to project himself internationally through partnerships such as Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, an association of Southeast Asian nations. That is, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, as well as other geopolitical environments such as the Middle East, Latin America, and Africa. Although Russia remains its main political and commercial ally as a Eurasian nation by the end of 2025, Xi Jinping appears solid as a rock, both in his governance, his governability, and the continuity of the Chinese Communist Party's project. He hasn't needed or wanted to reform the Chinese centrist party system, instead adapting it to new technologies for his advantage. In government and the state, the truth is that although the United States remains number one in terms of nominal gross domestic product, China is in a process of growth, which, according to many, could at any moment overtake the United States as the world's leading power. Although the United States maintains the financial hegemony of the dollar and military power, China would be surpassing it in several areas. For example, purchasing power in China today is higher and ranks number one above the United States. Added to this is the fact that currently, due to Xi Jinping's manufacturing expansion policies, China is positioning itself as the factory of the world. And we're not just talking about low-quality products, but products of all kinds. 30% of global manufacturing in the world is done today in China. China dominates 57 out of the 64 most important technological sectors worldwide, including areas like telecommunications, battery production, vehicles, among others. Many people focus on the idea that the world is heading toward a reality where China surpasses, or at least is surpassing, the United States as the hegemon in multiple global arenas. That's not even counting the fact that they have a higher level of social, ethnic, and cultural cohesion compared to the United States, which is becoming increasingly multi-ethnic and fragile. Outlook and optimism for China's future differ greatly from those in the West. Xi Jinping's China has ambitious goals for its future. Not only technological and material modernization for the rest of the nation, but in a few years, a major modernization of the military is planned to face war scenarios in places like Taiwan and the South China Sea. By 2030, carbon emissions are expected to peak, and volatile green energies will play a larger role. By 2035, the gross domestic product of 2020 is expected to double. And by 2049, on the centenary of the founding of the People's Republic, China is expected to be the global hegemonic power in every aspect. Although we don't know how long Xi Jinping will lead the destiny of the Chinese nation, The truth is that with its lights and shadows, he leads a historic process like no other. One in which, after the century of humiliation, we are witnessing the decline of North America and the West as the world's leading power and the rise of China and the East to this position, a system described as socialist, popular, technocratic, totalitarian, or as the final stage of communism or capitalism. China keeps surprising its scholars and critics. Xi Jinping, a pragmatic and calm man, has presented a program aimed at laying the foundations for China's greatness in the 21st century. In the midst of an increasingly complex and uncertain history, where every economic, political, and social action continues to be written in the ancient and gigantic China. Thank you all very much for watching this video. I remind you that your support means a lot to us by leaving your comments, giving it a like, subscribing to the channel, sharing the video with all your friends, and clicking the bell to activate notifications. This was Reynaldo Jose Carrillo Vilches for the New Encyclopedia. Thank you for your support and many blessings.